Hey guys, Mike Lewis from Truth and Liberty here, coming at you with video this time. So, greetings everyone. You can see what my face looks like now, and you can see my new Captain America shirt here. There's a podcast out there on theology called The Calvinist Batman, and so maybe my spirit animal or my spirit superhero for this show should be Captain America, because he's the most libertarian Avenger. He's definitely, for that reason, he's my favorite Avenger. I was definitely Team Cap on Civil War, but anyway, so maybe this is the Calvinist Captain America show. Not to be jingoist and pro America, but to stand by the sort of libertarian principles that Cap, at least in the Avengers movies, seems to have been espousing. But anyway, enough of that. Today I kind of want to talk about Romans 13 again. Wrap up the series that I started back in the fall. And where I started at, I kind of went through Romans 13, and I talked through the basic interpretation, the basic exegesis that I had, and sort of we got to this point where we could kind of have an argument for either minarchy or anarchy. Minarchy would be a limited government where it only concerns itself with very certain specific things, but there is a king or there is a state, democratically elected state of some kind whose job is to do those specific things. That would be a minarchy, at times called night watchman state or whatever. But you would have, their only concern is criminal justice, maybe national defense, which on my perspective would be just an extension of criminal defense. But anyway, they basically exist to bear the sword against people who actually commit property rights and aggression, property rights violations and aggression, etc. That's the purpose of government, as we saw in our study of Romans 13. So either we can have a minarchy that does that, or we can have sort of the anarcho-capitalist view of a market for government services. And so just getting to that point is probably like the most important thing on this discussion, because there's a lot of errors that come up with statism, and where we have the state doing all kinds of things that are outside of that charter, where even Christians or conservatives support the state doing these things because they have a wrong view of what the biblical purpose of the state is. And so where I've sort of left off our discussion so far is that if we can agree to say, well, the biblical definition of government, the biblical parameters for government is that they concern themselves with these specific things and nothing else, then whether we have a minarchy or whether we have an anarchy, anarcho-capitalist anarchy, is less of an important issue, honestly. And I fully believe that. If you're a minarchist and you have a view of saying, well, we want to have a limited government, and this is what limited government means, and this is why, and you can reason that out from Romans 13, I'm all for you. I used to be there. And since then, I have come around to sort of the ANCAP position. And so this episode, I think I want to really get to the point of why. Why do I really believe that an ANCAP position is better? And it's not just because. I think there are good ways of demonstrating, even from an a priori reasoning, why Rothbardianism and Hoppeanism, Hoppeanism, I don't know how you say that, but whatever, the views of Rothbard, Murray Rothbard, Hansard, and Hoppe, you can defend those using good a priori reasoning. That's good. I think there's a place for that. I think there's a very good place for that. But I also want to make sure, because I think there's this perception, I know there's this perception that, at least among Christians, there was this perception in my own mind for a long time that these are man's ideas, and the scriptures say something else. And we can't take man's ideas and impose them on the scriptures, because the scripture should be informing our philosophy. Right? So I want to actually look at the scripture, and I want to go to the heart of the key issue here. And that's the repeated meme, taxation is theft. And it was put to me once, not to me specifically, but to a Facebook group I'm in, a particular Facebook group that you are all very familiar with, that the question was stated, how can taxation be theft? Do you even Romans 13, 6 through 8? That was literally the post. And I wrote about this on my blog a couple weeks ago. And I actually took my comment that I posted, and I sort of fleshed it out a little more and posted it on my blog, and it ended up being like 6,000 words, which is insane. But I want to really go, and I want to look at the heart of the issue here. Why I believe that we should actually reason logically that taxation is theft from the scriptures. So let's go and actually consult what the scripture says. So I'm actually going to go read. I'm not going to put it up on the screen or anything because I just figured out how to record myself on video. I just figured it out, but I'm still low tech here, so I'm not going to put it up on screen here. I'm not going to do a Dr. White thing where I have two screens going on and multiple cameras, and I got the little thing where I can expand up the scriptures and everything. I'm not to that level yet. We're still doing this pretty low key here, but. Let's just grab your copy of the Bible or just listen along. I'm in the English Standard Version, and we're in Romans 13. This is verses 6 through 8. It says, "For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Now, before I go and start talking about this too in depth, I want to actually just pause and sort of go through what the actual argument is here that the minarchist is making. The minarchist would say, or the person who is justifying the taxation, whether they be a minarchist or an outright statist. The person who is justifying taxation here, their reasoning is, it says here, taxes are owed. That's the heart of the issue, right? So you pay taxes because they are the authority. So pay them their taxes. You owe them taxes. There you go. That's the end of the discussion, right? And it's sort of a similar sort of when you get to like verse 1 and you start talking about whether there should be a state at all, or how the king should be structured or whatever. And they say, well, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except for God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Well, there you go. God ordained civil government, looking like this particular view of civil government that isn't actually expressly communicated here. It just says that those who exist were given their authority by God, which is the decretive prescriptive will thing. We've talked about this before. So how are we to understand this verses 6 through 8? I totally and completely understand. Oh, I actually left off verse 8. Sorry. I read verses 6 and 7. Verse 8 says, "Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law." Okay, so I don't think that really necessarily changes their argument all that it impacts the argument all that much. Basically, they're saying God gave the authorities their authority. They need their taxes. It's owed to them because they serve you, and so you need to make sure that you don't owe them anything. So pay it to them, and by doing so, you fulfill the law. So again, I was here. I was there for a long time. I was a minarchist, and I sort of had a view that said, okay, yeah, the government should be limited, not constitutionally, but biblically limited to only the bearing of the sword against those who actually do evil, right? They only punish criminals. Any other use of taxation would be theft. So, for instance, wealth redistribution of any kind, socialism of any kind of, like take, for example, welfare, medical welfare, right? When you take from one person money to give it to another person, that's theft. I hope that we can all understand that. There are some who don't, and we would have to disagree with them. But I'm assuming that we're on the same page here for the most part. That the use of the tax revenue to fund things that are not within the charter of what's been communicated here in Romans 13 as the purpose of the government, makes the government the criminal who should be punished by the government. And so they are self-contradictory in that way. They're, in a sense, a performative contradiction. And so my view was, well, look, it does say they need taxes. They exist, they perform this function, they perform this role, they need their taxes, and so pay them. So, okay, well, we have a monarchy, we need to have a monarchy, we need to have a government, and so I guess taxes are justified, but only if they're used for the purpose of serving the purpose of criminal justice. So I guess we have to have a monarchy. But what finally broke my reasoning on this was the realization that I was actually presupposing something in my interpretation. I was presupposing that we had to have a monopoly. The monopoly is the issue. I was presupposing that there had to be one king. There had to be one government. There had to be one authority. And if pushed on that, I would start talking in pragmatic things like, well, how are you gonna know what the law is if you have multiple judges and multiple police forces? How are you going to know what law they're supposed to enforce, right? But that's whether or not that's a valid argument from a pragmatic standpoint. It's not, by the way, but whatever. Whether or not that's a valid argument from a pragmatic standpoint, it was still the argument that I made. But the point is, it was a pragmatic argument. And pragmatic arguments do not trump a priori reasoning about ethics. A priori ethics are more important than this pragmatism about, well, we want to accomplish such and such goal, even whether that's a good goal or not. It does not justify immoral action in order to try to accomplish that goal. The ends do not justify the means. And there is so much pragmatism in our view of government these days, just the world at large. Talk to most people, and it's all pragmatism. There is hardly any a priori ethics. And you talk to Christians, and most of them have a commitment to a priori ethics, but I think a lot of them has sort of accidentally, there's no intentionality here, but they've sort of accidentally accepted certain presuppositions. For instance, the one I had for a long time, there has to be only one servant of this, there has to be only one provider of this service. The service is bearing the sword against wrongdoers, right? So going back to this text, it says, "For because of this, you also pay taxes." Because of what? Because the authorities are the ministers of God attending to this very thing. What very thing? Bearing the sword against the wrongdoer, right? So because the authorities provide the service that God has appointed them to provide, being the one who bears the sword against the criminal, because of that, that's why they are owed their taxes. So my view, my interpretation, once I said, well, what if there were more than one? What if there was more than one police force? What if there were two police forces, two justice companies, two court systems, or multiple court systems? What if I lived in the ANCAP society? And somebody stole from me, and I called a police agency. And I said, hey, so-and-so stole from me. So they went and investigated it and then, filed criminal charges against the person. And then we hired a judge in a court to hear the case. They hired their own law firm to defend them. And we had a court case to decide whether or not they actually stole from me and what the just punishment of that should be. In that system, the only real difference between that and what we have now is that there's multiple options on each particular level, right? There's multiple police forces I could hire. He's got multiple law firms he could hire. There's multiple courts we could go to. And we could agree on the one that we want to go to based on what's mutually agreeable. I'm getting down to the weeds of the theory there. But the question that was put to me was, in that situation, who would I owe revenue to? I would owe revenue to the police force. I would owe revenue to the court. I would owe revenue, well, the police force and the court, right? Same as now, right? If I'm served by the police, I owe revenue to the police. Okay. A few years back, my car was stolen. The police came, filed a report. They actually found the car. Great. I feel like I sort of owe them something, right? But does that mean that I owe them more than that? That's where we start to get into reasoning that departs from what's actually here, right? My view is that taxation, what call it taxation, verse 7 tells us that we are to view it as fees, payment for services rendered, right? I think that we can all understand this. We are to view taxation as payment for services rendered. In that sense, we view it the same as, basically owing anything to anybody else for any reason I would owe them, right? If I order a pizza and they bring me a pizza, I owe them to pay for the pizza because they made a pizza for me and brought me a pizza, right? If I use the police force, I owe the police force compensation. But even if we can agree to that, I think we can understand from there that that does not necessarily mean that there has to be only one provider of the police force. There's not only one pizza service, not only one pizzeria. There's multiple pizzerias, and I can choose the one I want, right? The pizzeria doesn't have the authority to go around and say, you must order pizza, and you must order it from us. That's where the state, even in a minarchy, begins to operate outside the charter of what's given here in Romans 13. So they do two things, and I just described them there. They do two things. They command and coerce subscription to their service, not just if I have a need, right? Like when my car was stolen and I call the police, that's a specific situation where I call the police to come and deal with that particular crime, right? Not just that, but they require that you have this ongoing subscription, so that more like an insurance policy, where if you ever do need them, you'll call them, and they're your on-call police force agency. So why do they have the justification to mandate that sort of subscription to their service? Where does that come in? The reality is that applying that sort of mandate to people in society requires the use of the sword against people who are not criminals. Other than the fact that, the state got to wave their hand and say, oh, let's make these people criminals, by demanding we're going to create this law that is a positive law apart from any other standard of justice, and we're going to go then say, well, because you didn't perform this positive thing that we told you to do, we get to violate your natural rights. No, the government exists to protect people from having their natural rights violated. Government exists to protect people, or to protect people from having their natural rights violated, to adjudicate and punish people who violate their natural rights. To go out and then say, well, we're going to pass laws that coerce you to behave in certain positive ways, and then we're going to call you criminals and take away your natural rights because you didn't perform those positive actions that we commanded, is not within the line of what's in Romans 13. And it makes them a contradiction to themselves. Then the other way that they do this is that they wage war against competing providers. They mandate that you subscribe just to them. If anybody else were to try to set up a police force, then you would be outside the realm, or you would be attacked, right? If I tried to set up Mike's police force here in my town and say, hey, don't call the city police. If you've got something, call me, and I'll come deal with it. They would come and attack me they would consider me a terrorist, or some sort of enemy combatant or something. I don't know what they would call me. But they would come and attack me, and they would drag me into court, and they would do some sort of violence to me. They would take away my property or my freedom or something, because they would consider me an enemy to them, because they have this claim to a territorial monopoly. But that claim is not legitimate, and it requires the enforcement of a mandate on people. It does not allow people the right to say, well, I will subscribe if I want to. I mean, you could subscribe to say, okay, I'll subscribe to the police force, and I'll call you whenever I need anything, and you'll agree to protect me in certain ways. Or you should have the freedom to say, I'll call you when I need you. Right? In no way would giving people that freedom violate what's here in Romans 13. You're still paying for the services that you are rendered. If there's a market and you want to subscribe to this police force instead of that police force, there's no way in which that violates what's here in Romans 13, because you are still subscribing to a police force. You're still paying for the services that you use. So to try to defeat that, then, the view that, well, since anarcho-capitalism doesn't violate what's actually commanded here, and a state enforcing a monopoly requires them to behave in ways that are outside the charter of what's here in Romans 13, which, by the way, to drive that point home, when the state violates when the state violates that charter, when the state enforces that monopoly on people, they have to fund the enforcement of that monopoly command, right? They have to fund the enforcement of tax law. And so, since that tax law is not within the scope of what they're commanded to do here in Romans 13, if our standard is, well, taxes are justified when they're used to fulfill this role, and they're using that taxation not to fulfill the role, but to do something else, then those taxes are theft. In the same way that we would say any government who they're supposed to enforce property rights, or supposed to enforce non-aggression, they're supposed to enforce don't kill, don't murder, don't steal. And when that government starts redistributing wealth, the taxes that they would use for that wealth redistribution are theft. They're stealing from one to give to another. Same thing here. Taxation, enforcement of the tax law, is not part of what they're commanded to do in Romans 13. So any taxes that fund the enforcement of tax law are theft. So even a minarchy cannot escape the self-contradictory nature of what they're doing. They have to steal in order to have a monopoly. So the ANCAP system does not violate Romans 13 in any way. Minarchism does. So we have a preference for anarchy. We have a preference for the ANCAP system. So when you make that point, when you make those two arguments to people, usually what happens, usually what I've heard, is some sort of social contract argument. Well, you do benefit from the police, right? Because in their view, it's a public good. That's not exactly a social contract necessarily, but they'll talk about public goods theory, or they'll talk about social contract. One of those two things. The public goods theory basically goes, you benefit from the police, whether you actually directly hire them or not. Right? You benefit from living in a society where, police enforce laws. Okay? Let's take it a step further even, right? Let's say there's a robber going around your community and he robs your neighbor's house. Your neighbor calls the police and they arrest the robber. That's totally between him and the police, right? Well, you actually benefit from that too, because the robber does not then come and rob your house because he's in jail. So do you owe anything to the police for that? That's that's probably actually the best objection I've heard. Because the other objection, social contract theory, I may have to do a whole episode on that. Because social contract theory is complete nonsense. But I'm going to have to get into that in a different way. So let's talk about public goods. Hans Hermann Hoppe does a really good job of destroying public goods in his book, The Economics and Ethics of Private Property. But in there, he basically goes and he says, well, there's two problems. Number one, you cannot actually clearly, you cannot advance a definition of public good that you actually apply consistently, right? So if it's anything that anybody can benefit from without financially contributing to, the non-exclusivity thing. So like if I build a road, I can't keep other people from driving on the road. If I have a police force and the police force enforces crime and arrests a robber, I can't keep other people in the community from benefiting from the fact that there's one less robber in the community, right? So the idea is that it's kind of a freeloader issue, right? There's freeloaders out there, and so those freeloaders sort of owe it to everybody else to help contribute to the service, and B, there's sort of this pragmatic idea that, well, if everybody else is like, well, somebody else will hire the police, so I don't have to. I'm going to have to wait for them to do it. And then I can get away with not hiring the police, right? I can save money, and they'll pay for it. And if everybody thinks like that, then nobody's going to do it. And then there won't be a police force. Right? That's the idea. And there's a lot of problems with that. But because they reason from that, they say then, well, it's necessary and justified to force everybody in society to contribute to this public good. So Hoppe says, well, first of all, you cannot actually advance a consistent definition of what qualifies. It seems to be pick and choose, right? And he talks about, his rose bush. He has a rose bush in his house, and his neighbors all benefit from that because they get to see the beauty of the rose bush. Is that a public good? He might actually improve his home. I might do renovations on my house that increase the property value of my house. And because property values work the way they work, your property value is dependent on the property values of all the properties around you. And if I improve my property value, I'm improving your property value if you're my neighbor. Should you be required to pay for my renovations? Or another example he uses is deodorant. He rides the bus. He wears deodorant. The people who sit next to him, they benefit from that deodorant. Should they be forced to pay for his deodorant? And he talks about other things also that are considered private goods those things are considered private goods that function kind of the same way as public goods. And there are some things that are considered public goods that function sort of the same way, that would function sort of the same way as private goods. And we talk about roads, and really any public good can actually be provided as a private good. If you're interested in that, check out Walter Block's. He gave a great talk at the Mises Institute, and it's called The Case for Privatization of Everything. And you can find that on YouTube. I might even put the link in here. It is a fantastic talk. And he talks about roads. He talks about how you could have roads as a private good, and it would work. And he debunks every single objection against it. So the whole idea that people sort of owe it, or people have to contribute, well, you can't really advance a consistent definition of what qualifies. So should we have everything that could theoretically fit that definition? Or should we only do certain things? And why do we pick and choose the things that we do? But also, there needs to be a clarification made here that I don't benefit the same way that my neighbor benefited, right? My neighbor, let's take the robbery situation. My neighbor was actually violated. He was actually harmed. This is a hypothetical situation, by the way. This didn't actually happen. But let's suppose he was robbed. Somebody came in, broke into his house, stole his stuff, calls the police. The police come and they arrest the guy. They compensate him, get him to restore him to. Which, by the way, this is never what happens with police, but that's a digression. The police come and they serve him. They catch the guy. They arrest him. The guy gets made whole. Good. I benefit sort of indirectly from the fact that the robber doesn't come to my house next, right? Do I owe it to the police? Well, no. Because my neighbor benefited directly. He actually used the service. I did not. I may somehow get an indirect benefit from it, but sort of like the deodorant, sort of like home improvements, etc. If I'm not a direct beneficiary of it, if I'm not somebody who uses the service directly, there's no justification to force me to pay for it, even if I can somehow, benefit from this. Unless you're going to talk pragmatics about a freeloader problem, which, by the way, is, we talk about and say, if there are people who are actually directly harmed, they're not going to sit around and go, well, I'm going to wait for somebody else to hire the police to come take care of the fact that I was actually robbed from. You don't think like that. If I'm robbed from, somebody breaks into my home, I'm going to call somebody to come take care of the problem, or whatever. So if I come home and I find that somebody broke into my home and stole my stuff, I'm actually going to call the police and I'm going to deal with that problem. I'm not going to sit there and go, well, I hope somebody else calls the police. Nobody does that. Nobody thinks like that in real life. And so there will still be police, because the anarchist detractors will always fond of pointing out that humans are depraved, right? So yeah, there's still going to be crime. There's still going to be a market need for police, and so they will exist. And so we will have a society where police exist and law is enforced. And so people will benefit from that, even without needing to coerce anybody to support it. And because there is a difference between a direct beneficiary and an indirect beneficiary, there's no justification to coerce the indirect beneficiaries to fund the direct provision of the service. But we're getting sort of in the weeds, right? We're starting to talk about economic theory. We're starting to talk about pragmatism. Notice how we deal with the text, and it sort of puts us in a certain box. It sort of puts us in a certain point, right? And unless we start with presuppositions, like there has to be one provider, or we get to the point where, without those presuppositions, this is what the text says, and this is what logically it must mean, lest we have contradiction, and then we go, well, what about this other thing that's not from the Bible, right? Notice how that goes. If you don't do either of those things, you wind up with ANCAP. I don't see it any other way. I can totally bear with, and I can totally understand minarchists, especially if they're the ones who are like, well, given the fact that we don't live in an ANCAP society, and it's very, very unlikely that we ever will, and we probably couldn't ever get there anyway without some sort of violent revolution, which, A, would be immoral. It would be a violation of what it says here in Romans 13 about not resisting the governing authorities, which, by the way, I plan to do an episode on what that means. I can think of like 4, maybe 5 ways that you can resist the government. So I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to talk about, so 4 or 5 things you should not do. As a libertarian, as an anarchist, don't do those things. Anyway, violently overthrowing the government would be one of those things. So just a spoiler alert on that. So there's no way to get to an ANCAP society without some sort of violent revolution, which not only would it be a violation of Romans 13 here, it would also come with all kinds of pragmatic problems like Robespierre and the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. They overthrew their oppressors, and then it just ended up being worse because the pendulum swung. So there's all of that, right? So, because we live in a state, under a state, we live under a monopoly, because we have, we're probably never going to get to an ANCAP. Let's adopt a more minarchist approach to restraining our current government to only doing the things that Romans 13 says. From that standpoint, I'm totally on board with minarchy. I mean, and I can support a guy like Ron Paul, who, he was in government, but his entire time in government was spent trying to reduce government to the night watchman. And if Rand Paul was a little more like that, if there are other guys who are a little more like that, I can totally buy that. I would really want a guy like Ron Paul who can articulate the non-aggression principle, who can articulate the principles of Rothbardian anarchy. and who adopts a minarchist position just as a compromise with the fact that we live in a society that has, you know, a monopoly state. Given that fact, we're not going to go try to overthrow them. We will try to restrain them to, as we use our vote. We're going to prefer a state that is a minarchy. I can say, okay, I'm a minarchist in that way, but not in the sense of saying that means their taxes are not theft. No, taxes are theft. Taxation is theft. In an ANCAP society where your taxes are your subscription fees or your service fees to the police force or the courts or whatever, as you use them, as you contract with them for an ongoing protection agreement, or as you call them as you have need, call those taxes if you want. None of those would be theft because they would all be voluntary. They would all be actually payment for actual services rendered. But anytime you have the state not rendering the service directly and just enforcing people to subscribe, whether they render the service or not, and then not rendering the service, and then using that tax revenue to fund the enforcement of the tax law, you have theft. Even if the only other thing they do is to justly enforce just law, then they're still stealing, though, to fund their use of the sword to enforce the tax law and to oppose competing providers. And so, for that reason, even in that society, taxation is theft. And that's just, where I think logic pushes us, forces us. That's my view. That's how I understand it from reading Romans 13 and questioning all the presuppositions that I bring in, and saying, well, let's find a view that doesn't contradict itself here, because truth is not contradictory. So since I have an a priori commitment to the principle of non-contradiction, this is where I wind up. And I don't see any contradiction between ANCAP and what Romans 13 says. The only contradiction I see is between ANCAP and the presuppositions that non-ANCAPs bring to Romans 13. And so I think anarchy, as defined by Rothbard, as defined by Hoppe, is actually biblical. Now they flesh it out. They are not themselves believers, so they may not use biblical language in their talking about it. They flesh it out and carry it further into like practical applications and everything. They go and take the logic a few steps further than what we're given here. But working out from there, we should always work back to, well, what's the fundamental principles here? Are they biblical? And what I see from Rothbard, from Hoppe, is very much dependent on biblical view of man and biblical view of government, from what I've just read here in Romans 13. So that's my view. If you disagree with me, I totally respect that. I understand how this is a hard pill to swallow, because for me it was too obvious that there had to be a state when you read Romans 13 for a long time. And I heard about anarchy and I'm like, these people are just trying to find a way to wiggle around and get out of Romans 13. And you might be listening to me and going, man, this guy just sounds like he's just trying to worm his way out of this, like an Arminian dealing with Romans 9, right? And if that's how you feel, then by all means, don't feel like you have don't feel dumb, don't feel like you have to violate your own conscience. If you feel like your conscience says, no, I need to be a minarchist because of this, then by all means, go with that. I would be very interested in hearing what your reasoning is, because I'd like to interact with that. But anyway, that's just my view. Feel free to disagree with it if you want. Really appreciate it. I appreciate the listen. I appreciate the time. Obviously, our production value is still pretty low around here. This is just something. This is more just my random musings and my ramblings on these subjects. I trying actually intentionally not to be super polished, because that requires a lot of time. And if I chase that wind of being too polished, I will end up never putting out an episode. Because I have 5 kids, I have ministry at my church, I have a full-time job, I have life. And so you might hear my kids in the background. You might hear my phone warbling at me to remind me that I've got meetings coming up in half an hour. You might hear all kinds of stuff going on. I might ramble, I might stutter, I might sound sort of like I didn't organize my thoughts very clearly before I got down and started rambling, and I hope you can still follow what I'm saying. I hope I'm not boring. I hope I'm making sense. I hope that you're learning from this. I hope that if there is a serious flaw in my reasoning, that it's clear and obvious, and that you can point it out to me. Because I don't want to have flaws in my reasoning. And so if I've got a flaw in my reasoning, by all means, tell me what it is, and I'm going to interact, and we'll go from there. So very much appreciate it. I hope this finds you well, and I hope that I wish you, my listeners, well, and stay with me. Thanks. Bye.